Big fan of that. All right, so hello everyone. My name is Ryan Hollis from representing Orca Security. This is how to protect your cloud environment from the Netrunners. I'm a big fan of the CyberPunk universe. We're going to dive into a little bit of a fictional scenario to start out with, but I promise you all of this is going to tie back to modern day, and it's going to be very relevant to some of the things that you're encountering in your own organizations. All right, so imagine with me here. It's the year 2077, and you're a security engineer at the Arasaka Corporation. Like today, like any other, you don your virtual reality headset and access your virtual desktop, reviewing incident, traffic data, your tickets, your dashboards, but most importantly, what catches your eye today is in your newsfeed, you see Cytech, a leader in cybernetic augments and prosthesis. They have just been hacked. They've been a victim of a massive data breach. Now, what happened here, they happened to leak tons of customer-related PII, health information, and so this is a significant data breach. And by all respects, they could be considered to have a much more locked down cloud environment than your own. So it's only a matter of time before this happens to Arasaka Corp. So let's dig into some of the details around this hack. Fortunately, we already know who's responsible. Small gang of Netrunners. For those that don't know, Netrunners are cybernetically enhanced, augmented hackers of the future, constantly roaming the nets for confidential information to steal and sell for profit. Now, some of the details of the hack. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So, what the intelligence that we've gathered is the attackers spent a lot of time in the reconnaissance phase, enumerating all the domains and subdomains that for Cytech, like Dan covered in his last talk, and rethinking enumeration. That was so relevant to how attackers operate today in the cloud, especially in that reconnaissance phase of mapping out IP addresses and getting that initial attack vector mapped out very well. So they spent a lot of time in this phase, and they were able to identify an internet-facing virtual machine with a management port open. It turns out in this case, they had a very weak password on that management port, and it was able to be brute forced. From there, that gave them then their initial access onto that virtual machine, where they did some digging and were able to find configuration files and backups containing cloud credentials in the environments. That's a huge no-no, that's a huge hygiene risk. From there, the web application that was running on this virtual machine, they were able to exploit a server-side request forgery attack to another instance and retrieve that temporary access credential associated with that virtual machine. From there, with that temporary credential, you essentially can access any resources that the credential is privileged enough to access. So, with this new credential in hand, they were able to enumerate through all of the storage buckets in the accounts. They eventually found something very interesting, database instance.logs, outputs. So you've got to store your database logs somewhere, right? So in this bucket, housing all of those logs, it turns out there was a connection string to connect back to the database to successfully authenticate. And with this in hand, they were able to authenticate with that database, take a snapshot of it, and download it to their original virtual machine that they had a foothold on. And from there, it's very simple to just download it directly to your C2 server on your own infrastructure. And Bob's your uncle. That's all there is to it. In this case, fortunately for Cytech, the data was encrypted. Unfortunately, our attackers had a black market quantum computer to decrypt all that information. Of course, it's 2077. Okay, so what are the main lessons that we can learn from this situation? First off, attackers are going to try to live off the land as much as they can because it's very easy for them to live off the land in the clouds. Like Dan had touched on, they're misconfigurations are rampant in the cloud. Not just on the DNS level, but the resources that we're spinning up and the IAM network, since IAM is a relatively new concept for a lot of our security engineers, the misconfigurations are rampant. But also hygiene issues, such as the configuration files and backups being left on that first virtual machine. That shouldn't happen. It just shouldn't. But it does, constantly. People don't clean up after themselves. And granted, all of our teams are stretched thin, we're all busy, and things slip through the cracks. So it happens way more than you think. Second, I'm a big fan of network segmentation. The cloud has these really great things called virtual private clusters, or just great ways to segment business units and applications that don't need to talk to each other, to segregate them away from each other, that go unused sometimes. So virtual machine 1 should not have been able to talk to virtual machine 2 in this instance. Also, in this situation, virtual machine 2 was using the basic instance metadata service, which is very easy to retrieve these temporary credentials from, which could be overly permissive, overly privileged. That's just a great way, a great opportunity for lateral movement in a cloud environment. Okay, those are some of the top concerns in the cloud. Now let's go back a little bit to our time quickly and discuss some of the top breaches. Capital One, let's tee it off with that. This horse has been beaten to death multiple times over. However, I'll take my shot at it. So in this case, in the case of Capital One, they had a misconfigured web application firewall that allowed for a server-side request forgery attack to call that same instance metadata service, but this was in AWS. It was IMDS version 1, which is a very easy way to retrieve those temporary credentials. In this case, they were overly permissive, and so there was a lot of finger pointing from between AWS and Capital One. In my opinion, and a lot of people's opinion, the primary factor was just the overly permissive nature of that configuration, and not necessarily the SSRF, because that vulnerability is rampant in the cloud. All right, number 2, we have Tesla. This is an interesting one. Ties back to the Kubernetes talk we had a little earlier today with Lewis and V. So in Tesla's case, a Kubernetes dashboard was exposed to the internet. An attacker was able to access this dashboard and taking the privileged tokens that are accessible from the dashboard, they were then able to access the cluster level secrets. And since this cluster is running in the cloud accounts, naturally you're going to want your Kubernetes cluster to communicate with other assets in the cloud, such as storage buckets, databases, what have you, you know. So they were able to grab those cloud account secrets, and cryptojacking ensued. So they wanted to utilize the computes to mine cryptocurrency. What also I did not see covered too well was the amount of data that was exfiltrated from S3. Excellent. All right. And lastly here, I just want to touch on these two. The blast radius, especially in the case of Accenture, could have been massive. However, they dodged a bullet. The moral of the story with these two situations, they were public S3 buckets when they absolutely should have been private. That's all there is to it. And it's so easy to do, and it's constant that I see customers with this kind of issue. All right. So with all of that said, I really want to take a second to address what I see happening in the industry. Most customers that I interact with are very hung up with a lot of the real-time detection, AI, machine learning powered real-time data exfiltration tools. That's what they're caring most about. However, what we're seeing in their cloud environments is that a lot of the fundamentals have been messed up, or they're just missing certain things that allow the attacker the initial foothold and the lateral movement possibilities for them to actually do their thing. And I just really want to focus everyone's attention on that now. Like a good audit of your cloud environments, of those fundamental concepts is very important. And it's not just me thinking this or my company, it's definitely, it's backed up even by AWS or the Cloud Security Alliance. The number one concern, as you can see here, is misconfigurations in the cloud of the platform and the resources running in there. And coincidentally, that's the number one thing that's getting exploited. It makes the attacker's life very easy to live off the land and not set up all these alarm bells for even the cloud provider native runtime protection platforms or the third-party ones. But admittedly, number two would also be the real-time detection piece. And let me just preface this. I will never say that real-time detection is not important. And anyone that does, I would greet that with a healthy amount of skepticism. But I'm saying we need to go back to our fundamentals and give more credence to that. All right. So with that said, let's dig into some issues that could have helped SciTech help prevent this breach by breaking it down into little chunks of areas of focus that will pertain to y'all. All right, first of all, would have to be data storage. So our storage buckets and our databases. These are our crown jewels in the environment. That we aren't here to patch vulnerabilities for vulnerability's sake. We're not here to address malware for malware's sake, or overly permissive roles just to say we did it. We're all here in a mission to protect the sensitive data in our environments, cloud or otherwise. That's why I think we need to have that as our starting point. The crown jewels in the environment, start there and map our way backwards. Determine how many hops it takes for you, your red team, whoever it may be, to actually reach and compromise those crown jewels. What are the service accounts or the applications or the servers that those applications are running on? What are allowed to access that sensitive data? And what kind of permissions do they have? And doing this in a graphical nature. I don't care if it's a pen and paper exercise to start, but it would be excellent to have open source tools, which I'll address in just a second, or even vendor provided tools that assist you with doing this exercise of mapping all the possible attack chains that someone could exploit or leverage to reach your crown jewels in the environment. That helps with the prioritization piece. It helps with your bandwidth. We're all stretched thin, and this helps you to prioritize the vulnerabilities and the misconfigurations that actually matter in the environment. All right. A couple other points that you may have noticed on there: determining which buckets are private and public in the environment, and should they actually be, and also what kind of data is housed in there. Having a tool to help you, like a regex kind of cool tool to allow you to identify PII or the patterns of PII, like email addresses, social security numbers, in the cloud environment, in those buckets, enumerate through them all, and determine which buckets house what sensitive information. All right. And of course, at the very end, it's last but not least would have to be encryption and transit and rest. IAM, this allowed for maybe not the initial foothold, but the lateral movement, certainly, in our example. Exercising the principle of least privilege, absolutely everywhere that you can in the environment, extremely important. Ways to help with that would be not moving away from the default roles by the cloud providers. Those tend to be overly permissive. Creating custom roles, granted, this is a little bit of a lift, but based on what that application actually needs, go in and audit on a step at a time to create custom roles, just giving enough privilege to what those applications actually need. And a big one would have to be moving away from the instance metadata service version 1. All the cloud providers handle it a little bit differently as well, but they all have that 169.254 IP address. Next, compute. So my number one thing that I learned at Orca, and I'll preach till I die, is having visibility. For the cloud environment or otherwise, having visibility into exactly what is running in your accounts. I believe that was mentioned last night on the CISO panel. I believe Jen touched on something similar this morning. So having a tool, open source is great. of exactly what resources are running in each of your cloud accounts in the environment, and the interconnectivity, what can that resource talk to? Extremely important, and that's fundamental. That's, we like to call that asset management. Second would have to be patch management, but prioritize patch management. As we said, as you know, we don't have unlimited bandwidth, and there's not an army of us in the security space, so you have to prioritize your efforts. Hardening the machines by utilizing minimal host OSs and stripping out tools that may be beneficial to an attacker. Here, it's extremely important because your fancy real-time detection tools could potentially catch when they're downloading things on the server that seem odd. That would seem anomalous, because anomalous detection tools are cool, but you need to set them up to actually shine by following best practices. That's all for compute. Network, this piece kind of ties it together a little bit. I have an excellent tool that I highly encourage all of you to use. It's called Cloud Mapper, completely open source, completely free. Please use this, it's sick. And it's great on the offensive side, the defensive side, and it basically it shows the interconnectivity and all the resources running in a cloud environments. And it's open source, so you can build on top of it to suit your needs, your organization's needs. Utilizing this for a tabletop exercise or the pen and paper exercise, like I mentioned earlier, to kind of audit the network and the attack paths to your crown jewels, extremely important. I highly encourage you all to use that. And wrapping it up here, in the Kubernetes and container space, I highly recommend you listen to the awesome talks by Lewis and V earlier this morning to learn more about that. All I could do is like skim the surface here with the time allowed, but utilizing Kubernetes RBAC, it is a thing. Security contexts, hardening that container to node relationship is extremely important, and preventing those containers from running those low-level Linux commands. That hardens it up. It's very important to address those. And network policies, making sure that container A can only talk to container C and not container B or any other container for that matter. It's just a step in the right direction towards segmentation and just hardening the environment. Okay. And lastly, all the vulnerabilities start with the application. And with the adoption of infrastructure as code, it's basically a 50-50 toss-up that I see people running Terraform or not in their environments. Detecting these issues as early as possible saves you money. It saves the company's monies, and it saves you time. So the application testing tools, there's a ton of them. Google will know better than me, so I encourage you to do some investigating there. Prioritizing the vulnerabilities based on what applications and their location, their location in the cloud environment. Are they on the attack chain? Is it giving you that initial foothold, or is it providing lateral movement for an attacker to reach the crown jewels? That helps with the prioritization piece. All right, and that's really all I kind of want to talk on. So, a lot of concepts that I just blasted you all with. All right, but I've got a few more things to say, but real quick, I'll just wrap it up with a little bit about me. My name's Ryan Hollis again. Originally LSU, Louisiana native. Just made the move over to Austin, Texas relatively recently. I'm very involved in veterans and security. VetSec is what we call us. Yeah, I was a cavalry scout in the Army back in the day. It was a great foundation to my professional life and just me as a person. Can't recommend VetSec enough. Please, if you're a veteran in cybersecurity, join them. And lastly, I have to shout out my company, Orca Security. I have learned so much there. We have amazing security researchers. The blog is lit, as the kids would say. It's an incredible research articles, just time and time again. And if you feel like you could benefit from like an agentless approach, or if any of these vulnerabilities or issues that I mentioned about in the cloud are relevant to your organization, just give them a try. Message me, or look them up on their website and request a demo. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. We might be out of time.
Any questions in the hallway, or at lunch, or with beer, or something close to that?
And I have many resources for all of you as well.
Okay.